Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Higman. I'm being told that it's now streaming live on Facebook, and I'm being told that it's now recording. So hopefully it is. If it isn't, I apologise for everybody. Welcome on behalf of the Network of Wellbeing. My name is Roger Higman. I'm the director of the network, and I'm replacing Flo here today, who normally hosts our webinar. Flo is around. She's doing some of the back room stuff that we normally do, and so we'll be great to maybe hear from her with fielding some of your questions later on. I'm also very, very pleased to welcome here today Duncan Fraser from Useful and Kind, a fantastic initiative that he's been leading. Duncan is also the originator of something called the Mindful Leadership Foundation and has been a leadership coach for over 20 years. Duncan's going to take over the whole webinar, we thought, because that's probably the best way of doing it. And so, yeah, great. And I'll be seeing you at the end. So, Duncan, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And so thank you, Roger and Flo, two amazing people, and often don't get bigged up, but I think we all hugely appreciate them and the rest of their team who makes these things possible. So take a compliment while you get it. We're really grateful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Really, as I say, gorgeous evening here. Wonderful to be able to spend time with you. I'm going to do a little bit of background about why Useful and Kind. What are we trying to do? What is it? I'm going to talk to how it came about. And then there's kind of 5 things that I'm going to try and do. I'm going to help us all reflect on how we can be useful and kind to ourselves. Look at then why we are prosocial. I've spent kind of 18 months looking at this, so I'll share some ideas. Then we're going to look at how we can be useful and kind to others. And then Roger's going to kind of catch up a bit on ideas that you've shared. And then I'm going to talk about why we might not be, fourthly. What are the barriers? And then finally, we're going to look at how we can be useful and kind to the world. But I'll put that in context as we go along. So where did it start? Well, it started from a group of people who were working with me at the Mindful Leadership Foundation as to feasibility on whether we bought a building or not. And we decided not to. And one of the advisors said, well, what would you like to do? And I thought, well, I'll have a think about that. And the very next day, I happened to see the Barack Obama speech to interns. And it's his birthday. And they've made him a birthday card. And there's a lot of very smart young interns all looking at him. And he's reading his birthday card. And he says, so I'm guessing you all want to be senators or congressmen. And they kind of all go, oh, yes, Mr. President. And he carries on reading the card. And then he says, so by definition, most of you will fail. And they all look crestfallen. And he says, whereas if you get up each morning with the intention of being useful and kind, then you might be better partners, you might be better co-workers, you might be better managers, you might decide to campaign for something, you might start working with an NGO, you might start working with a senator or congressman or woman, but your criteria will be how useful and kind have I been. And I was very moved by this and thought, that's it, that I just get it. And I'll say a bit more about that a little later. The second part of it was, having been around this world of well-being and psychology, I'm a trained psychotherapist, I've been giving a lot of thought to what's on offer in the well-being space. And a lot of our work is about the individual. It's about us, where we are, how we stay fit and healthy, our mental well-being and so on. And we will do some work on that. But I was thinking about Rosa Parks, who many of you will know is the woman who sat on a bus back in the 50s. And she was asked to get up. And I was thinking, well, if she knew everything that we know now, she would feel angry. She'd know she was angry. She'd know where that was in her body. She would have done her metta meditation, and so she would have felt compassionate to the person asking her to stand up. But then, should she have stood up? And my conclusion is, no, of course not. And for me, there was a little bit that's been missing in our world of how do we connect the well-being of ourselves to others, to the world. So that would include everything from a kind of psychological well-being to a sense of the part we play in communities, which now has done so much about, and also to the idea of social campaigning, social justice, and so on. And so I wrote a slightly provocative piece about how can we be happy when others aren't? Is that even possible? Which we can explore a bit more. So, excuse me, after a lot of talking and meeting wonderful people, we looked at how we might just make some sense of this, make it a practical model. And so we came up with what we call the SO model, which is basically how to be useful and kind to S, self, O, others, and W, the world. And there's a sense for me of, in order to have well-being, whether doing 5 things or 7 things or 21 things, it's not just about doing, it's about being. And how can you have a balanced being that's well in the world, given that, as a friend of mine says, you're dead a long time. So how can we make a difference? And an image I've been using a lot with clients recently is, how can you be the best tree? So a tree is not hoping to be another tree. It's not hoping to be the violet or bluebell underneath. It's just being the best it can be within the circumstances of the client and the soil and so on. And so I'll come back to that image because it really struck me as well, what is it that we need to be? And being a boy of a certain age, I realized that actually saving the world was no longer my gift. It's not possible. It's more than one person and it's more than one lifetime. And we just happen to be at a particular point in history where for many people it's better than it's ever been. There are still many terrible aspects. And of course, for those of you who saw wonderful Catherine talking about that and new economy and so on, then, you know, there are many things that we need to think about and do there. But first of all, I just thought it'd be interesting for us all to reflect on ourselves to start with, and the importance of looking after ourselves. You know, we need to be healthy and well for ourselves and for others and the world. It's which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But we had a little model, which I think you'll probably see backwards there. But if you happen to have a piece of paper, then just write down yourself and put 3 boxes next to it. One is the idea that this is something you've just planted, a seed, something that's maybe growing, and something that's flowering, that's doing well. But I invite you to think about that for yourself. So it might be something emotional that you're working on or you're needing to be useful and kind to yourself with. It might be something spiritual, whatever that means for you, whether it's the numinous or you have a faith. It might be intellectual. What is it that it's just emerging for me that I'm beginning to look at? It might be psychological. Am I struggling with something at the moment? Is there a pattern that's just been brought to awareness that I didn't know about? Do I find myself in situations going, how did I get here again? You know, we all find ourselves in these patterns that were set very early on. And one of my passions is attachment, which is the way in which we get to be secure or not in our first 2 years. And that informs that enormously. It might be something creative. We might have just started something new, be it painting or sport or a musical instrument or whatever. Or it might be something physical. It might be physical health, or I had a client today who's just set himself the marathon, and the last time he ran one was when he was 23 and he's now 56. So it might be something like that. So what I just invite you to do is to think about something that you want to do or be to be useful and kind to yourself. And just think whether that is in the planting box or the growing box or flowering. And I just lovingly invite you, if you're comfortable to share that in the chat box. Just share. It could be a word, It could be something that you think, actually, I'm doing quite well with that. Or it might be something that you think, actually, that could do with a bit of attention. So I'm just going to give a minute or so for you to pause and reflect on what that might be, and start adding things, if you're comfortable to, in the chat box or in the questions indeed. And Roger will be collecting those, and we can be reflecting on them later. But I'll just pause for a moment for you to think about yourself, how you can be useful and kind, looking inwards with kind, sparkling eyes, accepting who you are and who you're trying to be in the world. So, as I say, just when you're comfortable to, just put a word or two in the chat box, something that you think you're doing or is going well, or you've just planted. It might even be a plant, or metaphorically something that you've just started thinking, I can be useful and kind to myself. So not just kind. This is useful as well. There's tons of stuff on kindness, and that's fantastic. But useful and kind to yourself as well. Okay, so I'm just, as we start to share those ideas, I'm just going to talk about why. Why are we useful and kind? Why are we programmed to be? And there are three reasons, really. The first is genetic. The second are kind of norms of behaviour. And the third is about ways we help ourselves. So the genetic is really, really interesting. And of course, this goes back to us on the savannah with the scary animals. And if there were two groups, one that had more altruists and one that was more selfish, it was the one with more altruists that was more likely to survive. So rather than survival of the fittest, it was survival of the most cooperative. And all these things, there are references to and papers. And if you'd like to know what they are, then Roger's going to tell you at the end how you can be in touch with me. And there's quite a lot of them on our website. But that was really interesting for me. It's the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. The second thing is, as part of the genetic thing, is the way in which we cooperate. So monkeys and fruit bats cooperate. They share food. They alert each other to danger. And I think that's really interesting, because we often, we talk of the selfish gene, but actually that's completely misplaced, the latest thinking is. And the third part of genes is toddlers are programmed to help each other. There's that wonderful psychological experiment where you see kids who are given a number of sweets or piece of chocolate cake, and one is much, much bigger than the other, and automatically they look at it, immediately think, oh great, I've got a big one, and then will, 95% of the time we'll share it to make sure that it's equal. So that's the kind of genetic thing. I just want to make a couple of examples. Back to trees. There's that wonderful research recently that has shown that trees all cooperate. There's the wonderful stuff about the way they are communicating beneath the earth, that if one is slightly unwell, they will help each other by sending the equivalent of antibiotics to each other, with the noble exception of the black walnut, which apparently, when threatened by someone else, will send out poisons through the network. But broadly speaking, nature is there in this way to be useful and kind. The final way from the kind of genetic thing is to help ourselves. But I'm very cautious about this, and I was always cautious about it from setting up Useful and Kind. And there's just been a wonderful paper published by Oliver Curry of Oxford, because he's done a meta-study of all the kindness studies. And he's looked at the actual impact on you, on the actor who is useful and kind to someone else, who is kind to someone else. And the benefit is marginal. It's only just noticeable. And I've always thought we're not useful and kind to others in order that we feel good necessarily, but we do it because it's the right thing to do. So let me just move on to the kind of norms that we all have. And there's 4 of them. And the first is the good old, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So it's called reciprocity in the literature. In other words, I'm more likely to help if you're going to help me or you helped me last week. The second is equity. So it's proportional. In other words, if I give Roger a £5, I might be able to tap him up for a £5. If I give him 50 quid, then I'd kind of expect it to be roughly the same. So there's a kind of thing about equity. We expect in proportion to what we give. The third aspect of norms is it's the right thing to do. We're told it's the right thing to do, and we do it without necessarily needing to big it up. So for instance, that's why we give to charities. We don't expect a return. And there's a huge, massive, another webinar that's possible on effective altruism, for those of you who know about that. And the final part of the norms is just reinforcement. We get rewarded for doing it. You know, we're told when we're little, that's good, that's kind, that's generous, you know, play nice. And that's normally based on fairness and justice. And the final part of why we are useful and kind is just helping and sometimes healing ourselves in helping. So there's a lot of literature about something called the wounded healer. In other words, we are healing others, being useful and kind to others in order at some level to heal ourselves. Wonderful example of that is a woman called Laura Darrell, who founded something called It Affects Me, which was a mental health awareness campaign. She had been depressed, and she was coming out of that and had wondered what she could do to help others. And she saw Post-its on her desk, and she wrote on it, hashtag It Affects Me, stuck it on her forehead and put it online with a, you know, why don't you give money to Mind? 9 million people have seen that. And that had just come out of her desire to share and to heal others. So it's lovely to see some of the ideas that are coming in of ways in which you are useful and kind to yourself. I'm going to go on to others before we just summarise those, because Roger can kind of compare them as we get there. So let's move on to being useful and kind to others. Now, this comes in 3 parts, and some are harder than others. So I'll just give you the 3 parts before we again start reflecting. And the 3 parts of others are, first of all, the loved ones. The ones that are meant to be easy and kind to. Not always with our loved ones, but, you know, those that we would die for, we'd give things for. The second, and I believe the answer to the world's problems, is those who are hard, those we find difficult. So depending on your political viewpoint, and given the new economics, it might be the wealthy, it might be the obvious shorthand political leaders that we know and don't need to name. And there's, I think, if we can get to a place of acceptance, of unconditional positive regard for them, to use the Carl Rogers language, that sense of understanding who they are, why they think the way they do, does that come from some kind of damage or otherwise, that is how we can begin to have conversations with us and make a difference in the world. I put on my Facebook the other day that I was in Essex the other day and got in a cab and started talking about Brexit. And I was just really, really trying to be empathic and loving and understanding the fear and the defense, and that led to this privileged position of this person. And the third little category of others we have is what you might call team or system. That could be your family. It could be the team of people you work with. It could be a football team. That kind of sense of the close organisation. So not the world out there, but others. So what I'm going to invite you to do is the same thing that you did personally. So if you could choose one of the three, either someone you love, someone that's tough at the moment, that you know, that you're in contact with, or a team that you're part of, a family group or a sports team or an arts team that you see a lot. And again, would you come up with an idea of a way in which you could be useful and kind? Or maybe you already are. And just put it for yourself in one of those three categories. Is this an idea you've just planted? Is this an idea that's growing? And if it's growing, how is it growing? Are you watering and tending it? Are you cultivating it? Or is it starting to blossom and flower? And just, again, I'll just give us a moment to pause and reflect. So just as we've considered offering tenderness to ourselves, being useful and kind, let's offer that lovely idea of being compassionate, open, tender towards others, whether they're loved ones, the tough ones, or the team. And again, I just invite you to share some ideas in the chat, something that you're working on at the moment, something that's going well, or an idea you've just had for someone, whether loved, difficult, or team. Notice the ones that are easy to do that to. Just notice those that are a bit tough. What's the cost to you? And then just add some things, add some ideas, share with us if you're comfortable to, so that we can just reflect and share the ideas with each other. Indeed, practicing being useful and kind to those of us together today at this moment. And then I'm just going to invite Roger to make any reflections on the things that people have written or for himself. If you're comfortable to do that, Roger.
Definitely. It's fascinating, and I think there's a lot of people here who've, trying to build in rituals in the morning, and about being kind to the self, regular morning meditation. And I know myself, I'm trying to get back into doing more regular morning exercises, and then there are others who are focusing very much on trying to see and accept difficult emotions, not necessarily changing them, but just recognizing them, which I thought was a really nice way of putting it, and noticing it, and so on. Through to other big ones that people have talked about, writing a book, one of the things that came out. So lots and lots of stuff that people are doing, but very much I think the emphasis was on trying to build this into one's daily life, finding a time, possibly in the morning, possibly in the evening, where we focus on ourselves for maybe 15-20 minutes and improving ourselves.
Thank you, Roger. And I've just seen some lovely ones for others, which I guess everyone can see. I love this idea of being supportive to children equally. That's a tough thing, isn't it? It plays to their script of, am I the favourite? Am I the favourite? I have two daughters who still sign Christmas cards, your favourite daughter.
Yep.
To which I respond, your favourite dad. And that's hard sometimes. I love the idea too of a daily brief for your team. I wonder if it's also worth asking them what their daily brief is for you and others. That's a nice one. And non-violent communication, fantastic. What a great thing that is. And I've forgotten the name of that wonderful organisation that brings people like the people across the Northern Ireland Divide, or in the Middle East. I've been to one of their lectures in London. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the organisation. Fantastic demonstration of just what is possible from people absolutely at opposite ends of whatever particular spectrum it is. New strategies for measuring well-being, that's always good. And helping those who are lonely. Absolutely. Funnily enough, Roger and I were talking about that just before we all joined together. Loneliness is going to be one of the huge issues of our time. The research shows, I think it can, that those of you who really are from positive psychology will know better than I, but I think that the statistic is that a solid, ongoing, authentic, loving relationship, for those of us privileged enough to have those, can make a difference of up to 10 years of your life. I was reading the other day, social care organisation that had to cut services, and to a husband and wife who had been together for 67 years were being sent to different care homes, which is just inviting separation and loss and pain. And, you know, that will bring us on nicely to the world and the structures that we are in. But thank you so much for sharing those, and for sharing them with others and the rest of us. It's well worth paying mindful attention to those. And of course, for those of you who use the metta meditation, others, it's a great way to do that. It's just to offer that, but also to do it. I love in the meditation the idea of offering that deep compassion to a neutral person, to someone that's maybe a receptionist, someone you buy a paper from. Just that sense of having that spirit and attitude in the world is hugely helpful, and not always easy. No one is kidding that it's always easy. So just before we move on to world, I just wanted to share with you why we sometimes don't. What are the barriers to it? Well, I think there's 4 barriers. The first is proximity. It's that classic thing of, we see someone or a member of our family who is in need, we help. We see a neighbour, hopefully we do. We don't help those we don't see. So other side of the world, an issue that doesn't impact us, the whole stuff about climate change, you know, if we don't see it and it doesn't impact us, or we wait until it does impact us. So I think there's also something else about, do we know them? Do we like them? Are they different to us? How do we defend against difference? And we see that classically in the world of American politics at the moment, this defense against difference. And that's just been such a blight, I think, that defense against difference, be it disability, be it sexuality and gender, be it any number of aspects of ways in which we can make ourselves okay and the other not. And how can we be useful and kind in that debate? What does it look like? Okay, the second is a whole kind of clutch of things, but it's called the bystander effect. And there's been a lot of research on this. And if you are so minded, or you're a YouTube addict, then just type in the bystander effect and you'll get a ton of very interesting videos. Basically, it comes from research that was done around an incident that took place in 1964. There was a 28-year-old woman called Kitty Genovese who went back to her flat at the end of the day, and she was attacked. And the attacker then got in his car, but heard her screaming and got out the car, went back, pulled her into a corridor in a tenement block and killed her. And she was screaming. And 38 people heard her scream and didn't do anything about it. And she died. And there's been lots of kind of interesting research about this. I won't waste a lot of time now. But as I say, if you're interested, just look it up, because a lot of people have recreated it and it's really scary to see. So you'll just have someone lying on the floor in the reception in a school, and the number of people who would just walk by. And there are 5 conditions that we apply before we will be one of the people who does something about it. And the first is we have to notice them. And so often we don't. We're just walking by. And, you know, for those of us who go to London a lot, now there are more and more homeless people. I was walking down Tottenham Court Road this morning, and now it's getting very sophisticated. There are tents all down by Heals and Habitat and so on. And it's now much more common. So do you notice? And there's a wonderful bit of psychological research here, which was done in a theological college in 1968, where the theological students are told that they're going to go and have to give a presentation on the Good Samaritan. And they're told that this is very important and they're going to be judged on it. Half the group is told that they'll be talking about the Good Samaritan, half told something else. On the way to the room where they have to give the presentation, there is someone lying on the floor. And they'd all been told that they had to hurry. And none of them stopped to help the person, which isn't just about theological students. It is about all of us. And so the second reason, the second part of that, noticing, is time. If we are pressured, we don't pay loving attention. The second is we've got to interpret it as an emergency. So is this person really poorly, or are they just drunk, or are they just messing about, or whatever? The third is we always assume someone else knows better. So if you're in a crowd, you will always assume someone else is a doctor or a health professional. The fourth is we've got to know the appropriate form of assistance. So, for instance, does that person need CPR? Do they just need water? Oh, we feel terrible, we don't know, so we won't do anything. And each of these is a barrier to involvement. And the final one is just before you make the decision, unconsciously you're going, is it too dangerous for me? If I get involved in this, what will happen to me? Will I look foolish? You know, how will that be? And so they're all the barriers to us actually just being human and going, can I help? What do you need? Although, of course, you have to be wary that it's not a psychological experiment with the camera around the corner waiting for you. The third of the 4 barriers is, again, just have a look on YouTube or look it up. There was an experiment by Bryan, B-R-Y-A-N, and Test. And this was where there was a car that was broken down on a motorway, and there was a woman stood outside the car. And then 2 miles further down the road, there was another broken down car with a woman standing by. I'm sorry, it's 1968, so it's a very gendered experiment. However, what happened was the person in the car driving by was much more likely to stop if they'd seen someone helping the first time. So if there were these 2 random cars with just two women broken down, people were unlikely to help. Whereas if they saw someone the first time, they were much more likely to help. And I think that's really important. So if you're in that position, don't wait. You be the person. You be the change you want to see. You help and just offer. The final thing that I think is really important for all of us, especially working wellbeing, and especially whose jobs are and life's purpose is to help others, is compassion fatigue. Many of you may know there's a woman called Olive Cook, who committed suicide about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, and because she had received an overwhelming number of requests from charities for help. She was on a mailing list, and in the days before data protection, of that particular kind of data protection, she was just getting lots and lots of requests, and she felt completely overwhelmed by it. Significantly, this has now changed charity law, this particular case. But there are times, aren't there, when it's just overwhelming. I, at one stage, was very interested in psychosocial support for those working in humanitarian aid areas, and did some thinking with Red Cross and others who are now world leaders in it about that sense in which we give until it hurts. I remember saying to dear Roger here when he was at Friends of the Earth, there was a culture there of, why would I go home? Because I've got the world to save. And there is that sense in, I'm going right back to where I started. We have to look after ourselves. We have to be healthy in order to help others. So let's just move to the final bit, which is then looking at the world. And this is what is slightly different to other kindness and compassion initiatives. So let's just think, what are we doing to be useful and kind to the world? Are we overwhelmed? Do we think, don't know them, too far away? The question I always invite people to ask themselves is, what is it that only I can do? It might be from an interest, it might be from a passion. It's that thing of, if you move and you're steering a ship 1 degree, you might end up on another continent. There's a wonderful story that my wife tells of when she was at primary school. Her head teacher told her about a story in China. And everyone had decided that they would open the windows on May morning and shout hello. And they wondered how wonderful it would be if everyone over the world just shouted hello on May Day morning. And this little girl was really, really interested. She wanted to hear how loud it was. And other people also wanted to hear how loud it was. And then everyone wanted to hear how loud it was, until it ended just with the little girl opening her windows and shouting hello. And I think that's a wonderful example and moving. And I always think, let's just be the little girl. So what we might look stupid shouting out of the window, we might look stupid being the person that goes to ask, what do you need? How can I be useful and kind? So I'll just invite you finally in the last few minutes, just before we start sharing ideas and questions, again, would you just think about the world and think about, this might be something economic, what you're doing with your money. It might be something social, what you're doing with your time. It might be a political campaign that you're involved with. It might be something environmental. What is it about the world that you think only you can make a difference with, or only you with others can make a difference? So it's not just the, isn't the world terrible? Isn't the system terrible? Isn't the political structure terrible? But what is it that I can do? Is it signing a petition? Is it joining a party? Is it starting something new? Many of us here have started something new. So I just invite you again to take a moment to think about that and what you're doing to be useful and kind to the world. And is that in the planting category? Is it in the growing category? Or is it flowering? So just take a minute, and then when you're comfortable to, again, I would invite you, I'd love you to share with us some of those ideas. And just notice also any script that you might have about, I should, I ought. Don't join with that. Just allow yourself to go, well, I could just do this little thing. I could just join with others in this. Try to resist the temptation to be overwhelmed. It so often is. If I look through my Twitter feed, and I'm, joined to so many of these things. then that can be overwhelming. So just share, if you would, things that you're doing for the world. And then Roger's going to share some of the ideas he's seen, or some for himself, and we can share questions. Over to you. Thank you so much.
So if you've got your suggestions for things you do in the world, just put them in the chat box at the bottom there. And thank you for that, Duncan. That's great. Also, can I draw your attention to the Q&A? If people want to ask questions, they can just fire in a question in the Q&A, and I can summarize them, or I can raise them with Duncan. So if you've got anything you want asked while we're doing that, that would be no problem. One of the things I was going to ask you, Duncan, while we're on this, is could you say something about your experience of putting this into practice? I mean, you were doing a summer school earlier in the year, weren't you? And
Yes.
you're working all over the world. I mean, you talked about working in Africa and working in North America and this sort of stuff. Could you say something about how Useful in Kind is working in practice?
Yes, really happy to do that. So at the moment, in two ways in particular, we had a summer school for 21 16-year-olds. Just want to make an apology to those people who couldn't hear me because I had paper over the mic. Really sorry about that. It's gone. 21 wonderful 16-year-olds, massive social range, from young people from a school where 112 languages are spoken to young people at a school that costs £32,000 a year. So a wonderfully diverse group. We supported them psychologically. We had 8 mentors. We did leadership development, personal development, and we used this SO model. So on the third day, we worked with 2 social enterprises, and the young people planned for themselves a community meal outside York Minster for a homeless group that worked with at that particular time. So that was the start of it. It was absolutely transformational for the young people, and just a joy and privilege to be with those young souls at that time when they were starting to think about what difference they're going to make in the world. Roger's right. We're currently investigating the possibility. People are asking us whether we might do one at Harvard and one in Tanzania with a community project there, and others. So we're just at that stage. The other things we're doing is that we had a pilot Useful in Kind primary school in Cheshire, and we then did a piece of research with 4 schools in the northeast to look at what interventions could best develop this prosocial behaviour, being useful and kind. And that was fantastic. And interestingly, in spite of all the fancy research that we did, the intervention that best helped become prosocial was simply using the question, was that useful and kind? People developed behaviour policies on it. They developed personal development policies. We're developing a curriculum model for Key Stage 1 and 2, and we're just about to have a pilot secondary school, and we're working on a feasibility as to how to develop a mark for schools from spring 2019. In a nutshell, that's it.
Wow, it's an awful lot of work. And I'm just looking at some of the things people have said. They've talked about, for example, being positive in my daily interactions, which I think is very much something that's relevant, particularly in terms of social media and this sort of stuff. Safi's planted joining a local campaign to keep the indie cinema open by ensuring we go every month. It's a great idea. It's a way of enjoying oneself and also supporting something locally. And Ella has talked about deep, compassionate listening and tender care to loved ones, new people I meet, and people in need. For instance, homeless people. When I push past some of these 5 conditions, I passionately believe in the power of deep, non-judgmental listening, and I hope to spread this, maybe in the future, bring this more and more into organisations and charities. I think that's right. I think that issue, Ella, of listening is incredibly important, but also being willing to genuinely enter into dialogue. I think is critical. I've got a Q&A one I want to mention, which is from Judy Thompson. I believe kindness to self and others should be part of the curriculum. My local council has shown interest in working with me to achieve class plans, but I'm no expert, and while happy to work with them, shouldn't there be something more professional at a higher level? What do you think of that one, Duncan?
Absolutely. Just get my email from Roger at the end, and we'll tell you about the work we're doing to develop curriculum models around it. And we're at very early stages, but working with teachers, we've got an education advisory group. Without encumbering schools with more stuff. Goodness knows they have enough, and they're not really useful and kind to themselves. I know, I'm married to a head teacher. But we are doing some really exciting work around that. But as I say, both from the research and from the original pilot school, simply asking, was that useful and kind, has huge effects on the behaviour. What we want to do, obviously, given SOW, is to be working that through a curriculum model, and it's even there at Key Stage 1 about the world and what you're doing politically, socially, economically, and so on.
Yeah.
But I'm really happy to give any information.
About grown-ups as well, because one of the things that we hear about in the newspapers is this supposed corrosive power of social media. We're on social media now.
Yes.
And there are huge advantages to social media. I mean, Network of Wellbeing, a lot of the stuff we do is done through Facebook and Twitter. Are there ways that you feel we can actually communicate using those media without these corrosive effects that people talked about, without people getting into slanging matches, without people throwing brickbats at each other and this sort of stuff over the web? Yes,
I mean, it's really interesting, this, and let's just talk to ourselves for a minute. Those of us who are clearly trying to be compassionate and do something in the world, it is really hard. It's really hard when you sign up to Twitter feeds or Facebook or whatever else, when most people are pointing out to you what's not right. And I think that's a good way to start. I'm a newsaholic, so even at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm reading the news, and I try to always think, is there anything I can do? If not, move on. If there is something I can do, what am I doing? And just be selecting my social media accordingly, and always go to Network of Wellbeing or go to Positive News. And Positive News is wonderful stuff because it does show what there is. Sadly, it's not daily. But just focusing on that is really helpful. But it is massively corrosive, and it is massively corrosive for teenagers. It's and digital natives as they are, it's different. We don't get it. Sorry if there is a digital native amongst us, but we don't get that. And it is, back to my interest in attachment, it is a way of being attached for children. It's your community, it's your tribe. I notice, and I've just, I notice when I get back on the train at night, is people will go, "You'll never guess what he said today." And you just think, oh, wouldn't it be so much easier if you just talk to each other? I've worked with people before who, I worked with a very senior chairman once who said, "Oh, I've got this terrible chief exec, I don't know what to do. I think I'm going to sack him." And I said, "Oh, have you had a conversation?" "Well, no, everyone else is good enough." So it is that just loving it. Whoever said that,
making sure that whoever we've got to talk to them, and that's the way forward. And I think, I think keeping that talking. I think one of the things that I feel about the social media is there's an awful lot of pressure. People in particularly in things like the Guardian, the Independent, saying, "Oh, we should come off Facebook, come off Independent." Actually, possibly what we need to do is to find ways of talking to people who we don't agree with and listening to them in ways that do help people and who do help us learn from them, and rather than just come off the groups and pretend they don't exist.
Well, it's a tough one to do, but that's my second category of others, being equal and kind to the difficult ones. And I don't know how some people do it. You think of Jack Monroe, the wonderful cook and chef and writer, who has lived her life on purpose and is helping in all sorts of ways and helping the original food bank that helped her. Occasionally you see the things put on Twitter, you just wonder how she gets out of bed and keeps going. I mean, she does it with humour, which is great, but I think staying focused and staying positive, and as I'm really sorry I can't see who it was again said, deep compassionate listening and tender care, that's it. Really, it's Ella, thank you. it's just love, isn't it?
Brilliant. Maybe that's a good place to stop. That's fantastic. Thank you, Duncan, for everything you've done. And if people want to get in touch with Duncan, there's a contact form on the Useful and Kind website, which is, you could find on Google, but if you don't know it, it's just www.usefulandkindunlimited.com. We're going to be shutting down fairly soon. I'd like to thank you again for all your contributions. Thank you all for staying with us. And just to remind people, there's another Network of Wellbeing webinar in about a month's time. This one's with somebody called Andy Bradley, who's been an expert in leading compassion circles, particularly with the NHS. And he's got a lot to say about how we can all work together to create a more compassionate environment, working environment, and social interaction environment. You can also check out previous webinars on our Facebook page, on our Network of Wellbeing website, www.networkofwellbeing.org, which is well worth having a look at, and see some of the others. And we'll be sending around links to the recording of this webinar, and links to future webinars in the next couple of days. So if you're not already connected with us, stay in touch on social media. Our Facebook page, you can like it from our website, you can like our Twitter feed, and keep up with all the news. And there's also an option for signing up to a newsletter, which guarantees you get it in your email box. So thank you very much for your attendance, and look forward to seeing you all next month. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.